Sorry for the mic up. Welcome to another seminar. Very happy to welcome Geoff Isaac with us today. So I'm sure most of you know, but I'll briefly mention some of the highlights, I suppose. So we're here to talk about Geoff's new book, Making Plastics and Products, which is just out. Is it available?
Yes.
And of course, you know Geoff's previous book on Grant Featherstone and his expertise in mid-century modern design. We're going to hear about his expertise in plastics and sustainable design. So I won't waste too much time talking about Geoff, and I'll hand over to the man himself. Thanks, Geoff.
Great. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for this opportunity and your efforts in putting this seminar series together. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to elders past and present. 450 million tons of plastic every year. That's how much plastic we're producing. And it sounds like a big number, but it's really difficult to sort of visualize how much plastic that is. So I thought I'd start by showing you, just focusing on one little thing, which is cling film, that useful product we all use to wrap up an avocado in our fridge and hopefully keep it fresh for a couple of days. But one of the big uses of cling wrap is to wrap products that are put on pallets to be shipped around the world. And in fact, now we transport nearly 1 billion containers worth of products around the world each year. 60% of them contain products that are put on pallets like this. Each pallet, as you can see, uses 60 to 90 meters of film wrap to wrap it in place. So if you do the maths, and I've got ChatGPT to do them for me, that's enough cling film to go from here to the sun and back every year, and maybe even twice, depending on your assumptions. And that's just cling film, which represents 1% of the plastic that we use in a year. So if all the plastic we produce in a year was used to make cling wrap, you'd have enough to go around the earth 1.5 million times, which create a wall of cling wrap around the equator, which is 18 meters high. That's as high as the White House around the entire planet. And that's just 1 year's production of plastic. And it gets even worse. Between now and 2050, the plastics industry is gearing up to triple production to 1.5 billion tons of plastic every year. And these sort of forecasts really came into focus when the Ellen MacArthur Foundation started to predict that by 2050, there'd be more plastic in the sea than there are fish. And, quite rightly drawing everyone's attention to the crisis that's happening in our oceans today. But of course, ocean plastics really are just the tip of the iceberg. Only 2 to 3% of plastics end up in the oceans. Most of it gets incinerated or burnt in open fields in less low-income countries, or ends up in landfills, where it sits for 300 or 400 years waiting to decompose. So as there's been more attention focused on these end-of-life impacts, we've also become more aware of the health impacts of plastics. And again, one of the sort of research projects that broke through was finding that we are actually eating a whole credit card's worth of plastic every single week. So that's about 5 grams of plastic that we're ingesting through what we're eating and what we're breathing. And of course, all these plastics contain chemicals. Up to 15,000 different chemicals have been identified, mainly unregulated use of chemicals to enhance the appearance of plastics or their performance characteristics. And at least 1,500 of these are designated as chemicals of concern. And they're causing all kinds of health problems, which we're only just beginning to understand. And of course, it's very hard to prove a link between any of these chemicals and an outcome because, we're all ingesting such a soup of these chemicals the whole time. How do you possibly research what the impact of one of those chemicals is? But we've got growing concerns about a couple of groups of chemicals, at least, like PBA and PFAS, or forever chemicals. But under the Biden administration, in February 2024, the US Senate threw out a proposal to investigate these health impacts. A Republican senator, you'll be surprised to hear, saying that while there was considerable public interest in the issue, the science is not clear. And as I said, the science was never going to be clear on this. PFAS, or forever chemicals, are getting a lot of attention recently. Frequently, they're used as grease and water repellents, and they're clearly linked to increased risk of kidney cancer. you may be aware, there's a big fuss going on at the moment. They've been found in the drinking water up in the Blue Mountains. And efforts to control these chemicals are presumably stalled in the States now. The EU is pressing ahead, trying to introduce legislation, and they're currently consorting with industry. And just last Friday, Porsche put out a statement saying the transition to PFS-free alternatives is associated with high cost of research and development. This proposal will render the production, approval, and market introduction of vehicles unfeasible, hindering the advancement of green technologies and electromobility. So we can either have EVs or we can get rid of the cancer-causing chemicals in Porsches, but we can't have both, evidently. So this is, a play straight out of the tobacco industry, but we're, confusing all these issues together and really just pushing off any legislation in the area. So how are we going to produce all this plastic? Well, the plastics industry is expanding like mad at the moment, especially in China and in Saudi Arabia and Europe. And here we are in America, where there's at least 12 new plastic facilities being built. Most of them, of course, down here in New Orleans in Cancer Alley, an area that's already got lots of fossil industry facilities, and then all these other facilities around the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, where you think now they'd be a bit more concerned about what's going into that Gulf. And then also up here near Pittsburgh, they're building a new facility. This is that facility. It's a bit hard to get an idea of the scale of it from just this one image, but if you have a look down here, there's some massive trucks, and you can see how many cranes are involved with it. It actually took 10 years to build, cost $6 billion, and quite surprisingly, Shell chose to announce the commencement of operations just days before the COP27 conference. And in May 23, Shell was fined $10 million out of having exceeded its emissions limit for the entire year in just the first month of production. So $10 million sounds like a hefty rap across the knuckles, but of course Shell received $1.65 billion in public handouts to get this facility going. At full production, it will consume 96,000 barrels of ethane per day and produce 1.6 million tons of polyethylene every year. And that's just one of 12 being built at the moment. And to get to the stuff that feeds into that cracker, the ethane here, this chart just shows you the number of processes that has to go through, from when they dig out the gas from the ground to get it into there. And so it just really shows you, each of these processes consumes vast amounts of energy, heating up to 650 Celsius. And so this is the real problem with plastics, not the downstream plastics we've all been focused on, but the upstream problems it's creating. By 2050, if we carry on as we are, we'll need 15% of the carbon budget just to produce plastic. So it's going to become, an increasing problem. And so what do we do with all that plastic? Well, 46% of it gets thrown away within 12 months of being manufactured. Huge amounts going into packaging. Only 11% of plastic goes into consumer products. So you might say, well, why am I worrying about, what's happening in consumer products? Well, obviously, there's been a lot of effort going on to the packaging market as well. People like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation successfully signed up over 1,000 organizations, getting them to make commitments to reduce their use of virgin fossil plastics. More locally, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation has signed up organisations to voluntary agreements to reduce their use of plastic or virgin fossil plastics in their packaging. But surprise, surprise, all those voluntary targets are not being met. So recently, APCO's announced, no worries, we're not going to make the 2025 targets, so we're going to rebadge them to 2030 targets. So we're going to carry on doing exactly the same things that we failed to do to reach the 25 targets. So that sounds very promising. And what's the reason for this? Of course, it all comes back to price. When everyone was happily signing up to these voluntary agreements, the price of recycled plastics was below the price of virgin fossil plastics. So of course, everyone was quite happy to say, yeah, we'll do this. Then when the world changed, especially around the time that China introduced the national soil policy, so they refused to accept waste from high income countries any longer. And so, and obviously all these people have increased demand for recycled products as well. So now we're at a point where the price of recycled materials exceeds the price of virgin fossil plastics. So again, people will just go back to that. So that's why I think concentrating this area is much better, because if the price of plastic is a renewable plastic, a recycled plastic, or a bioplastic is a few cents more than the fossil plastic, it's not really going to make that much impact on the price of consumer goods, especially high-end consumer goods. Whereas obviously if you're buying packaging by hundreds of thousands of tons, if you're Amazon, a couple of cents in the packaging is going to make a big difference to them, and it's just a cost they have to absorb. So I think there's much more opportunity to experiment with new materials in that segment. But anyway, let's go back to happier times, or certainly more groovier times, back in the 1960s in the space age, where everything was glossy and shiny and everything looked really optimistic. That everybody was trying, swept up in that enthusiasm of the space age and what technology could do to solve these problems. And one of these areas where you can most see this is in chairs. In my book, I use chairs as case studies. As some of you know, I do have a bit of a chair fetish, but there are legitimate reasons for using chairs, which I go into in my book. And chief among these is, the fact that whenever there's a new material, designers and manufacturers quite often rush to produce chairs to demonstrate, that it's structurally sound. And you think about things like, plywood after the Second World War, improved by polymers made from plastic, which Eames then brought into the furnishing industry and made his chairs from. And the same with fiberglass, developed during the Second World War by the US Navy. After the war, Eames again using it to form that armchair. And quickly everyone else rushed in to use this exciting new material. And obviously, and it really attracted the big name designers of the time, because they weren't restricted to doing, just chairs with the back and seat and four legs, as they had been for, since time began. Now they could explore these exciting curvilinear shapes and glossy surfaces. And the other great thing about fiberglass was you could, basically do it at home. As long as you were overcome by the fumes, you could experiment with molds and change them over time. So the result were these amazing designs, all of which have stayed in continuous production since they were developed. Now, also at this time, Cartel was setting up shop in Italy, and Cartel is a really interesting case study, as its catalogue reflects our changing attitudes towards plastics during the past 80 years or so. And its progress mirrors the development of injection molding, with the company producing increasingly larger products as the technology matured. So they weren't really interested in fiberglass so much, because fiberglass is about small scale, handcrafted production, which obviously means very expensive products. And so Cartel was much more focused on the mass market. And Annia Ferreri in particular was excited when the company started to focus on furniture, recognizing the engineering challenge and claiming that chairs suffer the greatest structural strain a designer is likely to encounter. So again, showing how chairs really got designers excited at this time. And so the search for a monoblock was the ideal target at this time. So everyone realized that, injection molding meant that you could actually produce a chair with one material, with one production process. And this was the pinnacle of design, as expressed by my friend of the local designer. But designers all over the world were really swept up by this challenge, not only because of the challenge of doing it, but realizing, of course, that this would be a mass market chair. You could produce these chairs very cheaply if you could actually achieve it. And Cartel led this race for a number of years, starting with the first chair made completely of plastic. You can see there, it took over 4 years to develop this chair and 50 prototypes. It's just a little child's chair. And even then, the molding technology wasn't big enough to make a big entire chair. So they had to mold the legs separately and clip them into the place. A couple of years later, they commissioned Joe Colombo to create an adult version of the same chair. And so this is his solution. But again, you can see that the molding technology is still not big enough to do a whole chair. So the legs molded separately and clipped into place. So despite these efforts from Cartel, the search for this monoblock was actually reached first by other people. So, first of all, we had the Germans with this Boffinger chair in 1996, the first chair made completely of plastic. And then a year later, Panton's wonderful S-shaped cantilevered chair, a real engineering challenge to get that one developed. And then following that was Magistretti's Celine chair. He challenged himself to improve on Colombo's design, which he said looks like an elephant with its thick legs, and sort of came up with this interesting solution of S-shaped legs to support the weight. And you can see here from that Boffinger chair, he really developed this L-shaped solution for the legs, which allows you to give much more structural support using minimal material. And then finally, in 1972, a French designer, Massenet, developed the first true monoblock that we see today, by the thousand in Bunnings, selling for about $20, and all over the world. It's now estimated there are more of these in the world than there are people, which is pretty depressing. But an amazing invention, and the real breakthrough here was linking the back with the front legs, which gives it much more structural integrity. And so that design obviously went on to be the prototype for the chairs that we see everywhere. And you could make this even at start in 2 minutes. Now you can make it under 1 minute. Just before COVID, it would only cost you $3 to make one of these. It's probably about $6 to make one now, which is incredible. That's why they're everywhere. But surprisingly, these chairs didn't make much of an impact when they first appeared. And in fact, they didn't really start selling into the 80s. And the reason for that was that, in 1973, there was this massive drop-off in plastics, not only for use in chairs, but across all consumer goods. And this is just a little number of chairs that I've got in my database of plastic chairs over the years, of designs that I think are noteworthy. Obviously, it's subjective, but it really sort of just illustrates that there was this massive drop-off in interest in plastics. And why was that? I think, there's sort of three major reasons. One was the price of plastics increased significantly. First of all, around 1973, there was the OPEC crisis, obviously, price of oil quadrupled overnight. And then towards the end of that decade, there was the Iraq-Iran war. So by the end of the decade, plastics were 10 times as expensive as they were at the beginning of the decade. So that obviously threw everyone's economic models into complete disarray. And at the same time, you had this rise of the environmental movement. And I think it's quite amazing when you go back and read this stuff, what an impact this had at the time. Not only was the Earthrise photograph obviously really drawing home to everyone the fact that we're on this tiny little planet, floating around in the middle of nowhere with finite resources, but things like the limits to growth. Every other house in the Netherlands owned a copy of this publication when it came out. And it was quite amazing. It's probably more widely read than the Bible, and it had a huge impact on thinking at that time. And on top of all this, there were quality concerns around early plastics. Your nice glossy, shiny surfaces, the promise of this future, this utopian future, started to get scratched and look dirty. And other products that were made quite often with the wrong or unsuitable plastics began to disintegrate, especially things that we're using in the kitchens, etc. So these three things, price, environmental, and quality issues, all came together. And there was a real disinterest in plastics for a few years. But that's hardly reflected in demand for plastics, because even though by 1979, even the plastics industry realized it had a problem, said the plastics has had it as a fashion story. It's found its place as a purely structural material for the garden and office furniture. Sebastian Conran, a prominent designer at the time, even come up with the name deplastification, because he was being asked by so many of his clients to hide the fact they were made for plastics. So this is where you get, consumer goods like kettles. You don't buy a plastic kettle anymore. You probably think you've got a metal kettle, but obviously if you look at it, it's got a plastic handle. It sits on a plastic base. Loads of components are plastic. So plastics just receded from our view, basically. And if you have a look around you, the more you look, the more you see. You're sat at wooden desks, but obviously they just made of chipboard and all held together with polymer glues, and then laminates held together with more glue, and some of them wood effect, polished with polyurethane. Our walls are covered in, you know, acrylic paint, and behind that there's just wires and plumbing, which is all made of plastic. And, you know, so everywhere we look, there's just plastic. It's just not that glossy, shiny surfaces that we saw before. And you can see that reflected in demand for plastics, which continue to go almost unabated, even though there had been this shift in taste towards more natural looking materials. And this actually went on for quite a long time. And there weren't really many chairs at all, and certainly nothing from Cartel between 1979 and 1999, which is quite remarkable, you know, because Cartel was very much into plastics. But in 1999, here we are at the Milan Furniture Fair, and suddenly Cartel's back with this new chair from Philippe Starck, La Marie, weighing just 3.5 kilograms. So it was hailed as, you know, the ultimate experiment in dematerialization. It actually managed to reduce the amount of material needed to make a chair down to just 3.5 kilos, and you could demonstrate its strength by, you know, smashing it with a sledgehammer from this industrial robot. So as you can imagine, it created quite a stir in Milan, and as we know, transparent furniture has now become, you know, the main feature for which Cartel is known. But it wasn't only Cartel that got back into the market at this time. Everyone was suddenly, all the big name designers were suddenly back in. So we had, you know, Cartel extending that polycarbonate range with Philippe Ghost, and then the O chair from Karim Rashid, Canadian manufacturer, very cheap chair selling by the million. And in England, Jasper Morrison with his air chair, introducing air injection molding to the furnishing industry, which obviously has become the standard now if you want to mold something big. And so I asked all these designers and others, you know, what was it about this time that suddenly plastics had re-emerged and were acceptable to show, you know, to demonstrate that they were these plastic surfaces. And no one really had anything much to say about the timing of this. But I think the real answer is, you know, what the plastics industry has been doing in the background for the 15 years before, leading up to this. They spent an enormous amount of money on recycling, or rather convincing us that recycling was the way ahead. So they introduced the resin identification codes, and you can see these are cleverly designed to sort of imply there's some kind of closed loop recycling going on. You just chuck your plastics in the yellow bin, and they will be re-emerge and reborn as, you know, similar products in the shops next week. And of course, we all fell for this, really. By 1995, the industry declared plastics recycling war is over. Plastics are now regarded as equivalent to natural materials, according to industry polling. And so, you know, they had this real reemergence of plastics right at the beginning of this century. And suddenly, as I said, everyone was back in, and most notably Cartel. So in 2014, reflecting on 15 years of success with its transparent PC range, Cartel announced that all efforts towards dematerialization were now abandoned. A press release proudly announced that following the introduction of La Marie at 3.5 kilograms, minimalism was no longer necessary. Louis Ghost weighed 4.8 kilograms, and the company proudly boasted even heavier and larger projects, including the Ghostbuster at 18 kilograms and this sofa at 30 kilograms, so nearly 10 times the weight of what they were doing before. But the reprieve was to be short-lived. Public awareness about the limitations in mechanical recycling has increased. And locally, you know, only number 1 and number 2, PET and HDP, if any hope of being recycled. You know, we're still told to put everything in the bin. But also, if you look at the recycling codes, you know, there's this number 7, which sort of gives you the idea that there's only 7 groups of plastic. But of course, there are 60,000 different plastics being sold on the market at the moment. So there are an awful lot that come under number 7. And, you know, and more recently, we're introducing biodegradable plastics, but this is actually really complicating our efforts to recycle materials. You know, if these materials get stuck in with either PET or HDPE, they can actually contaminate the whole batch. So, and there's real issues about how we sort them out. And even if they make their way to industrial composting facilities, all those facilities currently reject them because it's so hard to work out what is a compostable plastic and what isn't. So it's much easier just to say no and send it all to the tip. And of course, you know, locally we know LDPE, there was only one person who was pretending to recycle it in Australia. They're actually stockpiling it in numerous warehouses around town, it turned out. And we're going to, take years to get back to where we were. And of course, all this is further complicated by the fact that China suddenly stopped accepting everyone's waste, and we're now all forced to actually do our own recycling, which is, what we should have been doing all along. But obviously, to do that, it's going to take years to get the planning and the finance and build those facilities. So I think there's been a big awareness of the shortcomings of recycling. Oh, and finally, of course, this closed loop recycling idea has been blown away. I think we all realise that if we put a PET bottle in our yellow bin, it doesn't come back as another PET bottle. It probably gets turned into polyester and combined with cotton and goes off to the textile industry. So now, 2/3 of the average wardrobe is made up of synthetic fibres. Not Robert's wardrobe, obviously, but most people's. And there was also this big shift in attitude around this time, with this growing awareness that all our attempts at dematerialization weren't sufficient to keep up with, growing demand from population and from, growing general affluence, that people were just buying more products. So all our efforts really weren't getting us anywhere. We really need to think about system level changes. And, this certainly has been embraced by designers. And suddenly from 2007, you see this real surge of interest, and that green line there showing chairs made from I'm calling renewable plastics, which is recycled plastics and bioplastics. And I found like 60 different designs that have been made by the end of 2022, using all kinds of things. So, from post-industrial waste to household waste, from toys to ocean plastics, bioplastics, bio-based materials, both these, and then experimenting with new technologies like AI to hopefully gain better impacts from dematerialization. And so I developed a simplified LCA tool to compare the environmental impact of all these products and try and identify, which are actually delivering better environmental outcomes. It's too boring to go into here, but it's details in my book or on the website for those that are interested. It's not detailed. What I tried to do was find as much information as I can about these chairs, but it's actually quite depressing about how little information is available, not only because of the manufacturers, but the material manufacturers obviously are all competing, so they don't want to give away their secrets. So, and they're not required to declare what chemicals are in products, etc., or exactly how things are made. So quite often I came across designers who thought they were using bio-based materials, and it turns out to be something where it's just tiny bit of bio ingredient mixed with virgin fossil fuels, basically. So it's very hard to find that information out. But based on what I could, I sort of sorted between these different chairs. And around this time, Cartel had this wonderful come to Jesus moment where, Philip Stark told me he's working with Cartel to transform the company to a smart materials company. And from now on, they will work with only bioplastics, responsible plywood, and other materials made from human intelligence in efforts to develop a more sustainable products. It's fantastic news. 2014, only 7 years before this, they were saying, dematerialization's out the window. We're producing these enormous products. And look, I'm sure the fact that their sales declined 22% between 2016 and 2019 had nothing to do with this change of strategy. But in any event, I think it's good that it's happened. And and it's been a rocky road. So the first attempt was this chair from Philippe Stark. Announced with a big fanfare again at Milan. The whole thing was, using AI, they could minimize the amount of material they use. But you can see this chair weighs 3.9 kilograms. 20 years before, we created a chair using 3.5 kilograms. So did AI deliver on its promise? I don't think so at this stage. And also you notice it's made from post-production scraps, which is great, it's a recycled material, but because it is mixed material, it does mean you can't recycle it at the end of its life. Then, very ambitiously in 2018, Cartel attempted to produce what would have been the world's first chair made from bioplastic, and they had this design ready to go. They invested 10 million euros in a company which was promising to produce PHA at industrial scale. And basically the whole thing went bankrupt. The CEO was arrested in Italy. There's a huge scandal that's still playing out in the courts today, but Cartel lost all its money, showing, really highlighting the risk of, being an early mover in this area. And eventually they got to release this chair in 2021 using a recycled plastic. And then since then, all their new releases have been in recycled, mainly in recycled plastics. So they call it this thermoplastic technopolymer, which turns out to be a posh word for floor sweepings. So again, it is recycled, which is great, but you can't recycle it at the end of its life. And you can see more recently, their latest release, they've got this glossy, shiny surface that's a painted surface. So it's interesting to see that coming back into fashion, or maybe coming back into fashion. And then they've gone back and reissued all their back catalogue, which again, must have been quite a huge expense for them. So I think they're pretty committed to this strategy. All their transparent materials now done in polycarbonate 2. It says this is a material that uses a renewable raw material from the pulp and paper industry. But again, it doesn't really tell you much details about what it is. So we've only got their word for it, but it's better than polycarbonate 1, but hopefully it is. And then the rest of the back catalogue's been released in this recycled plastic. As I said, so that's sort of the Cartel story and how it's changed over time. Just to focus on a couple of chairs from my analysis, this was a lot of the bioplastic chairs didn't perform very well in the analysis because they had to be bulked up to provide the strength that was needed. And obviously that's got life cycle implications, through the amount of energy you need to make the chair, how much to transport it, how much you've got to get rid of at the end of the life. But the chair that did well, the best out of the ones made from renewable organic resources was this hemp chair. And of course, hemp's great in that, hemp, of course, needs no fertilizers and removes carbon from the atmosphere when it grows. And the other interesting thing to note about this chair is how it's made. There's been this real resurgence of interest in other technologies. For the last sort of 20 years prior to this, it's all about injection molding. If you weren't going to get that high volume, then you're out of the game. And injection molding is great on a per unit basis if you can hit a production target. But it's really expensive to get it going. You're talking at least $1 million just for the mold and the machinery to get a chair into production. But now you can use things like compression molding, much cheaper and much smaller production runs. So I think you've got this resurgence of interest from smaller designers, smaller manufacturers, realizing they're not locked out of the industry as they have been for years. And on top of all that, this chair stacks 4 high, which is good for transportation impacts again. So the problems with this, again, you need an industrial composting facility to get rid of it at the end of life. You can't just bury it in the backyard garden. There's only 20 of those in Australia, and around the world they're pretty limited. And as I said, they're probably not going to accept things like this anyway at the moment. Like most of these chairs, are expensive. And also, I've tried to introduce this concept of appeal in my analysis. So lots of eco-audit tools look at products and say, yeah, they're environmentally friendly or not. But I argue that, a lot of these products are god-awful ugly, and, people just don't buy them. So if people don't buy them and they're sitting on the shelves in warehouses or in retailers, then you've just simply wasted resources. It doesn't matter how good the environmental credentials are, you're still wasting resources by producing those products. So, how do you measure appeal? Obviously, it's in the eye of the beholder, really. But I'm saying in the case of chairs, there's several things that we can say. If you've got more colors available, then you're more likely to appeal to more people, because it's going to fit within their interior design or appeal to them in some way. And if you've got different variants of a chair, some chairs come as a shell, and you have different bases, a ski base or a pedestal base or a wooden leg base. And obviously that adapts that chair for different environments and different tasks. So that chair is likely to have broader appeal. So I've tried to measure some of those things and include them in my analysis. And in this case, the limitations are that you can only buy this variant of the chair, and there's only 4 colors available. But it achieved 14 out of 20. I had a range of scores for those 60 chairs I looked at. The lowest was 3 out of 20, 14 out of 20, you know, very respectable, well above average. And as I said, the best scoring chair made from a renewable organic resource. But the best overall chair was this one from Konstantin Gersik with Magis to develop this chair. As you can see, it weighs just 2.8 kilograms. So, you know, improving on Stark's sort of what he achieved with La Marie at 3.5 kilograms, but showing, you know, we're still getting diminishing returns from dematerialization efforts, as you'd expect. You know, you've got to sit on something. So how low can you go? And, you know, if you're going to use this chair outdoors, you don't want it blowing away in a slight wind. So, you know, we're probably reaching a limit of what you can achieve with dematerialization now. The other good thing about this chair is it comes off the production line stacked 12 units high, and it's optimized for transportation. So it fits into containerization completely without wasting space, and it can be recycled at the end of its life, according to Magis. So the only sort of downsides of this chair is available, you know, it's a monoblock, so you've only got that one variant. You can't get it with or without arms and with different bases. It's just take it or leave it. And there were only 3 colors when they've launched. They've increased that to 4th now. And interestingly, when they were working with this material, they realized it had these black speckles in it because it's this recycled material, which they get from their own production facilities in North Italy and from other manufacturers in that area. So they couldn't get rid of these black speckles. So they decided to lean into it and add more in there so they get a sort of uniform look and really celebrating that look of the recycled plastic. And, you know, that's obviously quite an important thing of trying to sell these things, that they're trying to make them aesthetically pleasing. And yeah, so overall they achieved a score of 18 out of 20. It's only held back by those sort of considerations about appeal. So finally, my important wrap-ups from, you know, what's to be taken away from working in plastics, not just with chairs, but more generally, you know, dematerialization. As we saw, there was that drift away from dematerialization around the time when we started to look for system-level changes. But, you know, I think it's important that we go back and remember all those lessons, you know, that a good product is as little a product as possible, as Stefan Diaz says. And, you know, and extend those lessons as well, but to look at the supply chains. So, you know, all plastics aren't the same. They can be made from oil and from coal or from gas. And, you know, increasingly cheap plastics coming out of China are made from coal, which is has the worst environmental impact. So, you know, we concern ourselves about where our timbers come from and only want to use FSC endorsed timbers, but no one's really thinking about plastics and, you know, where they come from. BASF offer a range of plastics that are made using renewable energy. So again, they're more desirable than plastics used, you know, with energy that comes from fossil fuels. And then also, you know, how about the manufacturer you're working with? Are they using renewable energy as well? And so I regard all those things as an extension of this sort of focus on dematerialization. And then, you know, when you've minimized the amount of material you're going to use, you know, try and avoid the use of virgin fossil plastics. There's loads of these new materials available. It's very easy for me to say, very hard to put into practice. You know, if you go to an injection molding company and want them to experiment with a new material, they're probably going to ask you for at least 50 grand up front because they know it's going to take an awful long time to work out, you know, what's the optimum way that it flows through a mold, what's the melting temperature, how long it's going to be in the mold before you can release it, etc. Lots of work, lots of downtime. But, you know, you don't have to go the whole hog. You can just introduce a small amount. So through, you know, a hybridization strategy, just introduce 5 or 10% recycled material and blend it with virgin fossil plastics. You're still reducing the demand for oil overall. Design for a long and circular life, you know, it's just general sustainability principles, important with plastics, and especially that you can, you know, disassemble at the end of life, and that all those components are labeled so you can identify them through recycling. And then finally, you know, promote the provenance of renewable plastics. I was going to link to a website here, but of course, it's the one website on the internet that's down today. But you can have a look at it in your own time. It's what Konstantin Gersik, you know, one of the best things about that project was Konstantin Gersik said, you know, usually as a freelance designer, you design a product, hand it over to the company. Once they're happy, that's the end of your relationship. And that's a big problem. But in this case, he got to work with the engineer at the facility who was actually doing the injection molding. So that's why he was able to perfect that to design so much. And he has also got to work with the marketing people at Magis. So he could tell them and really have the input into how this product's going to be sold and tell the story of that material and what the environmental benefits were. And Magis really gone to town and set up a whole little microsite to tell that story. And I think a lot of other people who could benefit from that, we really need to be told why, and especially if we're being asked to pay more for these products, what are the benefits. Okay, and finally, just to end on a happy note, as I mentioned earlier, the fossil industry anticipate that half the growth in demand for oil to the middle of this century will come from the plastics industry. The dependence, and this dependence is really their Achilles heel. So Carbon Tracker, a UK-based think tank, estimated if the growth in demand for plastics can be reduced from 4% per annum to 1% per annum, this would be sufficient to put the entire industry into chaos due to their sunk investments. So to achieve that reduction in demand, if you think about it, 11% of plastics are going into consumer goods. So if you could just swap out 25% of the plastic going into consumer goods and replace it with recycled plastics or bioplastics, you could hit that target on its own. And that's irrespective of all the efforts to reduce our use of virgin fossil plastics in packaging, or the bans for single-use plastics like plastic bags and cutlery, all around the world, apart from America, plastic straws. All these will help to meet this reduction in demand. And it's not just, and this isn't just really an idealistic pipe dream. That Shell cracker that I showed you, that facility in Pennsylvania, which has just been completed for $6 billion, it's up for sale now. And why is it up for sale? That's because in the last decade, the 21.8 million tons of polyethylene production have come online. Mainly in China again, Saudi Arabia is trying to get in on it. So they're producing 1.6 million tons up in Pennsylvania now, and they're realizing the writing's on the wall. So I reckon this is Shell is moving out and going to concentrate only on extracting gas from now on. It's not going to compete in that space. So it's a change of strategy from one of the big players, and I think is impacted by this, hopefully, drop in demand. And I think this really highlights, design really is a powerful place that we can make these small changes and really have a big impact. And so, thank you very much.
Yeah, we've got a bit of time for,
Shameless plug, I forgot.
Thanks so much, Geoff. I think you actually did explain this, but I have to ask, are we just remolding chairs on the Titanic?
Well, I think that thing at the end is our biggest power tool. I mean, the reality is that if we go to make a product, if we try and replace plastic with other materials, it's fraught with danger and usually ends in worse environmental outcomes. And the classic example is the PET bottle. If we went back to glass, we'd have 40% bigger impacts because it's heavier, transport impacts, etc. Or the new airplanes from Boeing, 20% less fuel than the previous generation. All the aluminium panels and rivets have been replaced with carbon fiber, so 20% saving is there. So plastics are the least worst solution, I think, and now we have this opportunity to work with these materials. I mean, there is no reason why a lot of these petrochemical facilities cannot concentrate more on recycling. We're seeing that, they're now introducing chemical recycling, or they're trying to rebadge that as advanced recycling because it sounds so much more palatable. But all these new technologies are coming online. So I think there's a real chance that, and especially if we can drive demand for those, that we can at least improve those deck chairs.
Thank you very much. That was beautiful.
Trying to end on I'm thinking more beyond the more affluent part of the world, and I'm thinking about places like Indonesia and India where I've been to several districts which are kind of home to several times the population of Canada. and the entire economy is based on reusing plastic. And there seem to be, to my mind, structural reasons within the economies of the poorer world, where the production of plastics seems to be vital to economic survival. So not only are there these sort of bowels of the city which constantly repurpose plastic, there's also tremendous hunger for plastic.
Mm-hmm.
And the premise of a better life that we take for granted is frequently embodied in terms of plastic goods.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes very difficult to turn those massive populations of emerging economies away from the consumption of more plastic, because after all, who are we to deny them convenience, like for food packaging,
Sure.
for instance?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and a big, a big issue is this whole business of, designing the bottom of the pyramid, where everyone suddenly introduced, we'll sell, cosmetics and shampoo and single-use sachets, which has been now the scourge of the developing world. These bloody things are everywhere, and there's mountains of them. But same argument, why should we deny these products to these people, and which is hard to counter as well. But yes, definitely, I think plastics will definitely have a role there, and so I think the way ahead is to really stimulate demand for recycled plastics and make available those opportunities in those markets. But often those markets are, unfortunately, the reality is we have a lot of waste pickers going through those, so we do have a lot of quality plastics being sorted, which can be recycled as well. So I think that might be part of the solution there. Does that answer your question? Hi.
Thanks so much, Geoff. My question's about maybe a bit of a two-part. Your study is looking at what most people would call designer furniture. Furniture we've identified potentially famous designers made by the largely European manufacturers. And that, of course, is like a tiny fraction of the total market of furniture products. So, but I guess what's the role, or what's the potential role for that kind of practice? Because it does play sort of an outsized role culturally, and in terms of driving discourse and creating desire or creating imaginaries about what a product could or should look like and be. So and is that your hope for that kind of practice, that it can play a kind of leading role?
Partly, but also I just pulled out a few examples today, but there's a couple of great examples from Brazil, from Braskem, which I trust Christoph about. From Braskem, the big facility there, they've got a real advantage that they've got a lot of experience in producing biofuels. So Brazil invested heavily in biofuels, so they produce obviously a lot of sugar, of corn and sugar down there, and so they've got a lot of experience in that, and they've turned that into creating bio-PE, which is this amazing material which has the same characteristics as virgin PE. So the beauty is you can mix it together, or you can recycle it at the end of its life as well. And they're actually expanding production and licensing it around the world now. And to answer your question, Tramontina, one of the big retailers in Brazil, worked very closely with Braskem to produce low-cost furniture using that material. So they've got monoblocks available for a very low cost in that market. So I think it can happen at all levels. I think you're right. I think especially when you're experimenting with these new materials, you need to find a manufacturer who's got money to put behind you and is prepared to invest in that development. As we saw, Cartel even took it to the extent of investing in the company that was going to make the material. So I think to begin with, I think you probably will start more traditionally with those people who've got access to the money and resources, and they want to obviously work with people with a reputation that they think can give them a winning product.
Any questions online from Lauren Nichols? She asks, in terms of environmental factors, how bad or good is the wicker chair? A bit left in here.
The wicker chair. Oh, that's where your wicker comes from, I would have thought. Yeah, and then off the top of my head, to be honest, there's always interesting LCAs comparing I'm sure you're all aware, LCAs sound like the most scientific way to compare products, but especially when you're comparing plastic products with something like a wicker chair, you really can cherry pick the data. So the data one supplier for virgin PE will be very different from another supplier, for example. In fact, it can be a 400% variance, I'm told, in the numbers you use. And obviously, if you input those, then your answer from the LCA study will come out differently. But in terms of a wicker chair, yeah, where it's come from and what resources we're using, what fertilizers, if any, etc., pesticides that are used in production.
There's also a question from Katrina, but it's quite long.
Oh.
So might be better.
Have to do that. I've got it there.
Oh, I can do it again. Here it is.
Thank you.
About microplastics.
All right.
Quite in depth.
Yes. Yeah, so it's about microplastics, and what we were talking about earlier is the chemicals embodied in plastics and how they're affecting us. So I think that has definitely had a big impact in this shifting attitude towards plastics that we've seen in the last sort of 10 years, and growing awareness of it. And as I say, I think it is incumbent on designers and manufacturers to start asking questions. I don't think it's acceptable that we're buying these materials from manufacturers who refuse to tell us what's in it. Sometimes you can get statements saying they will certify that it's PFAS free or it's PBA free. So at least that's the start. But I think the role of design there is really to start asking these questions. And so it's only 20 years ago, no one gave a hoot about what wood we were using. And so FSC timbers really have been successful, or they're not perfect or all like that. But I think they've been very successful in promoting this idea that we should ask questions about where our timbers are coming from. And I think the same can happen in a very short space of time with plastics as well, if we start raising these issues and demand answers for them.
Another just brief one, just an observation, just putting some threads together from your talk. I've noticed that in a lot of automotive manufacturing, a lot of car interiors are now putting in a really high degree of emphasis on the provenance of those materials, and there's a lot of recycled materials and a lot of innovation in those materials. That sort of makes me wonder why is it happening in that sector, perhaps more than it's happening in, for example, manufactured furniture.
Yeah.
And maybe the answer is that with a car, you have an extremely high volume, sort of a high margin, high profit, integrated product into which you can put some very controlled, kind of material designs.
Yeah.
In a way that's maybe not possible if you're making chairs.
Yeah. But I think the main driver there is legislation. So they're required to meet certain targets, especially in Europe and were in America. And so one of the easy tick off items is to do these things at the margin. But you're right, they've been hugely successful in implementing things. I was just going to draw your attention to one thing, if I can find it here. It's my blog about I'll let that find it, of course. It's coming down slowly. Yeah, but and a lot of there is an awful lot of claims being made about. I'm just trying to find this one that's very recent. I thought it was a great example of what's going on. Oh, I've got an article. I think this is a generic one. But it's basically when you go into a lot of these announcements they've made, I think it was Porsche again who put out a claim recently that its seats were being made from completely recycled material. And then when you get down the bottom, it's like 10% recycled on a mass balance basis, so it's really hidden away that it's small. But I think, you're right, definitely auto industry is leading the way in a lot of these materials. And I think we do need to develop closer ties with those materials that they're coming out of there. Yes.
Segueing off the back of that, from what Mitchell said, do you think that the innovation within the automotive industry for plastics is driven? I found it interesting that you said that chairs are like fundamentally a good benchmark for testing, like design constraints and limitations, but I would argue that the automotive industry is potentially more demanding with environmental resistance, weight bearing, structural integrity, componentry. Like I would say that is potentially a reason why the innovation is there. Like things like thermoplastic polyurethane was designed for automotive applications.
Yep.
Would you agree?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's definitely been an area where, as you say, a lot of materials have been developed for it. They're interested in weight savings, obviously, and then, more recently in reaching these environmental targets. So they definitely have led the way in a lot of materials. A lot of those materials, there was a great example a few years ago where BASF commissioned Constantin Gersig again to develop a cantilever chair. I think it was in 2011. And they had this plastic they were using in the automobile industry, and they wanted to broaden its use to consumer goods. And that was a bit of a failure, to be honest, because he developed this cantilever chair, but this particular plastic just doesn't have much give in it. So, with the cantilever chair, you need a bit of a bounce to make it comfortable. So I suppose that demonstrates that, there are different requirements in those different sectors as well. But I think you're right, that, there's definitely more that we can learn from that sector. And again, quite often, there's obviously a lot of IP issues in terms of getting into access what those people are doing and certainly what they've got into development.
Follow up from that, how would you as a designer or creator or maker respond to that trade-off between very harsh or strict design requirements or constraints while balancing that sustainability consciousness? So, for example, the automotive industry, like how do you respond to not avoiding virgin plastics while still meeting those strict guidelines?
Yeah, and I think, the way ahead is going to be a hybridization strategy. Again, this idea of just mixing a small amount of a less environmentally impactful material with virgin fossil plastics. I think that's, probably the easiest way that we can go ahead. And so then you haven't got those big challenges of, we're using a brand new material, what's the impact? Well, obviously, changing something in a car is enormously challenging. There's so many people involved in the creation of a car. It takes years to get those changes through. So it's definitely hugely challenging, especially in that industry.
We might have to finish up, or I don't know, is it a brief question or? We can
chat about it.
So thanks again, Geoff, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming along. We'll be back after the mid-semester break with more speakers, so stay tuned.